1. John Jones Subi, the fall of the golden child John Jones, was supposed to be perfect, young, undefeated, and destined to become the greatest fighter in UFC history. He had it all: talent, charisma, dominance. But behind the highlight reels and gold belts, the real story was darker. In 2015, Jones was involved in a hit and run accident in Albuquerque. The victim, a pregnant woman. Jones fled the scene, leaving his rental car behind, along with his wallet and traces of marijuana. The news broke and the UFC was thrown into crisis. Their poster boy, their youngest champion ever, was suddenly public enemy number one. Jones was stripped of his title, suspended, and vilified. But the UFC never truly let him go, because greatness sells even when it is tainted. He came back, and the cycle continued. Ped violations, brawls, duels. Every scandal followed by another comeback. The UFC could hide John S. chaos forever, but they learned one thing. When your biggest star is also your biggest problem, you don't erase him, you manage him. 2. Conor McGregor Cindy, the bus attack heard around the world. Conor McGregor's rise was meteoric, from welfare checks to private jets, from cage warriors to global stardom. But with fame came ego, and with ego came chaos. In April 2018, the UFC flew fighters to Brooklyn for UFC 223. Khabib Nurmagomedov had just confronted Conor's teammate, Artem Lobov. Conor's response: he boarded a private jet from Ireland with a crew of friends and a vendetta. They stormed the Barclays Center loading dock, and Conor launched a metal dolly at a fighter bus carrying Khabib and others. Windows shattered, fighters were injured. Chaos erupted. The UFC called it unacceptable. But behind the scenes, they turned it into promotion. The footage became a trailer. The fight with Khabib became the biggest pay-per-view in UFC history. It was the perfect contradiction, a criminal act turned into marketing gold. Conor got arrested, paid a fine, and walked away, while the UFC cashed in. Sometimes, the darker the scandal, the brighter the spotlight. 3. Quinton Rampage Jackson died the Hollywood car chase rampage. Jackson was one of the most charismatic fighters ever, a knockout artist with a personality as big as his slams. But in 2008, that charisma turned into chaos. Just weeks after losing his title, Rampage went on a wild car chase through California. Police said he drove his custom Rampage pickup on sidewalks, hit multiple cars, and fled the scene, all while being pursued by cops. He was arrested at gunpoint, and photos of his Rampage branded truck, with his face printed on it, went viral. The UFC scrambled to contain the fallout. President Dana White even flew out personally, claiming Rampage was exhausted and dehydrated. But rumors spread of a full mental breakdown, voices paranoia, no sleep for days. The UFC kept things quiet, kept him out of jail, and got him back into the octagon. For the public, it was a comeback story. Behind the scenes, it was a cover-up of a man spiraling out of control. 4. Tim Sylvia Swine, the Ped Confession. That changed the rules. Tim Sylvia was one of the UFC's first dominant heavyweights. A towering giant who crushed opponents with his power. But his reign came crashing down after one mistake he couldn't hide. After winning the heavyweight title in 2003, Sylvia tested positive for stanozolol, a banned anabolic steroid. Instead of denying it, he came clean, admitting he took it to look better and feel stronger. It was one of the first major Ped scandals in UFC history. The organization, still building legitimacy, went into damage control. Sylvia was stripped of his belt, fined, and suspended. But the UFC buried the story fast. They didn't want headlines about steroids, not when they were fighting for mainstream respect. Years later, Sylvia admitted publicly that the UFC downplayed it to protect the brand. His honesty cost him everything, but it forced the sport to evolve. The UFC couldn't hide behind denial anymore. 5. Brock Lesnar 2, the pay-per-view predator. Brock Lesnar wasn't just a fighter. He was a spectacle, a WWE monster turned real, life gladiator, and one of the biggest draws in UFC history. So when he returned at UFC 200 to fight Mark Hunt, the hype was massive. Lesnar won easily, powerful, dominant, unstoppable. Then came the truth. Lesnar tested positive for clomiphene, a banned substance used to boost testosterone. The fight result was overturned to a no contest. Mark Hunt was furious, suing both Lesnar and the UFC for knowingly allowing him to compete while juiced. Documents later revealed the UFC granted Lesnar a special exemption from USADA testing rules, allowing him to fight without completing the standard 6-month testing window. It was a PR disaster disguised as a payday. The UFC's biggest show of the year, built on a man they already knew was dirty. For Lesnar, it was just another headline. For the sport, it was a reminder. Money will always fight before morals do. 6. BJ Penn Fundi, the prodigy. S-fall from grace. BJ Penn was once the soul of Hawaiian MMA, a 2 division champion, a legend who embodied fighting spirit. But outside the cage, the story turned darker every year. Bar fights, street brawls, public drunkenness. In 2019, video surfaced of BJ fighting random people outside a bar and getting knocked out cold. Later, reports emerged of him allegedly assaulting a security guard and multiple domestic incidents. The UFC's reaction: silence. Penn was suspended quietly, never officially released, never condemned publicly. He had become an uncomfortable legacy, too famous to erase, too reckless to promote. For fans, it was heartbreaking. For the UFC, it was a reminder that legends can rot from the inside out. The prodigy had become his own worst enemy, and the company simply looked the other way. 7. Rachel Ostovich-Thivy, the survivor. The UFC stayed silent on not all dark secrets are crimes committed by fighters. Some are the crimes committed against them. In 2018, UFC flyweight Rachel Ostovich was hospitalized after a brutal domestic assault. Her then husband, MMA fighter Arnold Burden, was charged with attempted murder. The details were horrifying: fractured bones, bruised ribs, and emotional trauma. The UFC supported her publicly, but behind the scenes, the silence was deafening. No investigation, no statement on fighter safety, just another tragedy swept aside to keep Fight Week moving. Ostovich eventually returned to the cage, scarred but unbroken. She became a symbol of strength, but also a reminder that the UFC only speaks up when the story benefits them. Some comebacks are louder than victories. Hers was one of them. 8. Joseon Sun, the criminal. The UFC tried to forget Joseon fought only once in the UFC, but his name became infamous for reasons far beyond fighting. In the early days of the sport, he was known as a bizarre comedic figure. A fighter who wore a thong to the octagon and got pummeled in the groin at UFC 4. But years later, DNA evidence connected him to a brutal 1990 kidnapping and sexual assault case. The crimes were unspeakable. He was sentenced to life in prison. And even there, violence followed. Joseon murdered his cellmate in 2011. The UFC immediately scrubbed his name from promotional materials and archives. But history does to erase that easily. Joseon's story remains one of the darkest chapters in MMA history, proof that not every fighter belongs inside the cage, and some should never have been there at all. Behind every knockout, every belt, every roar of the crowd, there's a shadow, a secret, a scandal. These stories remind us that the cage doesn't just expose fighters' skill. It exposes their humanity, the greatness, the greed, the chaos, and the crimes. Because in MMA, glory and darkness often share the same spotlight. If you want more deep dives into the secrets the UFC doesn't want you to remember, hit that like button or Jon Jones might just drive off before you can catch him.